Montana Territory. 1881, the train hissed to a stop under the wide, gray sky of Billings, steam curling like ghost fingers around the wheels. Gwendolyn Tate stepped down with her hands folded tight around her bag. She didn't look back at the car she'd ridden in for 3 days across the plains. She didn't look at the man waiting by the station either, not until he let out a loud sigh and muttered, "Damn it, she ain't even speaking, is she?" He was tall, red-faced, and wore a suit that looked like it had never seen dirt. Gwendolyn gave him a polite nod, but stayed quiet. The man missed her. Arnold Platt walked a slow circle around her like she was a mule at market. "I paid for a wife, not a ghost. You gonna talk at all?" She didn't answer. Her voice had always been hard to give, not because she was shy, but because words had never come easy, not since her mother died years ago. Not since the fever took her little sister. Silence had been safer. Platt spat on the gravel. "No use. I will not marry a woman who won't speak. I want a wife, not a damn statue." He didn't even bother walking her back to the train. Just turned and strode off toward his buggy, leaving her standing alone with dust curling around her boots. Gwendolyn didn't cry. Instead, she sat on the bench by the station with her bag hugged to her chest, the wind tugging at her bonnet. She waited. For what, she did not know. Maybe nothing. Maybe just for the sun to lower a little and make the shame sting less. That was when she heard the soft clink of spurs and the creak of leather. "Are you Gwendolyn Tate?" a quiet voice asked. She looked up. He was tall, broad from shoulders to hips, and wore a worn trail coat that had seen more years than she could guess. He was not young, perhaps 30, but his face was kind. Tired, but kind. His hat sat low over deep-set eyes the color of dark coffee, and his jaw was rough with stubble. "My name's Quillen Boyd," he said. "I was just dropping off a shipment of fence wire, saw what happened with Platt." She blinked once, still not speaking. He looked at her a moment longer, then sat beside her, not close, not pressing, just there. "I do not got much," he said after a while. "A cabin up near Red Lodge, a couple milk cows. I run cattle for the Miller Ranch, fix fences, break horses sometimes. I do not got much, but I got peace, and I do not mind quiet." She looked at him then. Really looked. He nodded toward the bag in her lap. "You got nowhere to go. I can take you to Red Lodge. Not to marry. Not unless you want to, just someplace warm. You can think." Still, she said nothing. But she stood when he stood and followed him without hesitation. The ride to Red Lodge took the rest of the afternoon. His horse pulled a small buckboard and he drove easy, not rushing. He did not ask questions. He did not fill the silence. Halfway there, he pulled a wool blanket from behind the seat and handed it to her without a word. She wrapped it around her shoulders and watched the snow-capped mountains grow closer. By the time they reached his cabin, dusk had turned the sky iron blue. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a black dog padded out to meet them, tail wagging. Quillen lifted her bag from the wagon bed. "You can have the bedroom," he said. "I will take the cot in the corner. There is stew on the stove." She followed him inside. The cabin was small but warm, with handmade shelves, a wood table, and a rocking chair by the fire. Everything smelled like pine and smoke. She sat at the table while he ladled stew into 2 bowls. He set one in front of her and sat across from her. "You do not have to say anything, Miss Tate," he said gently. "But if you ever want to, I will listen." She looked at him, and for the first time in days her eyes softened. She stayed 3 days. On the second day she swept the cabin and scrubbed the floor. On the third she made him coffee before he headed out to check fence lines. She still did not speak, but she left a folded note on the table. "Thank you for your kindness." When he returned to find it, he smiled. That night they sat by the fire. She stitched a tear in her sleeve while he whittled a piece of pine into the shape of a horse. The dog lay snoring between them. "I lost my wife 5 years ago," Quillen said finally. Childbirth. Took her and the baby. After that I just worked, kept to myself. She looked up at him. I learned that some rooms are better filled with quiet than with noise that does not mean anything. He met her eyes. Your silence heals me, her breath caught. She looked down, hands trembling lightly around the fabric in her lap. She stayed another night, then another. By the end of the week, she was helping him milk the cows, feeding the hens, cooking supper. He did not ask for more. But each morning when she handed him coffee, their fingers brushed a little longer. Then came the day she spoke. He had just come in from the rain, soaked and coughing. She pulled off his coat, fetched him dry clothes, and set tea on the stove. When he sat by the fire, shivering lightly, she knelt beside him and laid a hand on his knee. You should not have gone out in that weather. Her voice was soft, rough from disuse. He looked at her like he had never seen sunlight before. You spoke, he whispered. She nodded, eyes wet. You do not have to, he said again, voice low, but I am glad you did. She watched the fire a long moment, then very quietly, I like the way you sit beside me. He reached up and brushed a damp strand of hair behind her ear. I like the way you stay. She leaned into his touch, just a little. But enough. That night, she did not go to the bedroom. She sat beside him until the fire died low, her head on his shoulder. When he pressed a soft kiss to her hair, she did not pull away. She whispered, I think I belong here. And he whispered back, You always did. The frost came early that year, curling over fence posts and window panes by late September. Gwendolen took to wearing a wool shawl over her shoulders in the mornings, her hands pink from the pump by the time she came back inside with water. Quillen had started chopping wood after supper, stacking it neatly beneath the lean-to by the cabin. Her voice hadn't returned as often as that first night, but when it did, it came with purpose, short, careful sentences that he never pushed for, never rushed. One morning, as the fog still clung low in the field, she stood by the stove, stirring cornmeal into a bubbling pot. Quillen came in smelling of smoke and cold air, his gloves tucked beneath one arm. There's a neighbor down the valley, he said, setting his hat on the peg. Older woman. Mrs. Eliza Hargrove. Lost her eyesight some years back. Lives alone, but she's too proud to say when she's needing help. I usually check in before snow comes. Gwendolen nodded once and handed him a cup of boiled coffee. Her fingers were red from the heat of the kettle, but she didn't flinch from it. I'd like to go with you, she said after a moment. He looked at her across the rim of his cup. Would you? I can mend clothing. Or read aloud if she wants. His brow lifted slightly, not in surprise but in something gentler. She'd like that, I think. They left after breakfast, the wagon wheels groaning over the rutted trail. The fog had lifted by then, and a pair of cranes lifted off from the creek bed, their wings wide and slow. Gwendolen kept her eyes on the tree's larch turning gold, cottonwoods shedding early. Quillen caught her watching the land more than once, her gaze moving in soft, thoughtful lines. You take to the quiet here like you were born to it, he said. I wasn't, she said without looking at him. But it's the first place that hasn't made my silence feel like a fault. He said nothing, only set the reins down gently in his lap and let the horses slow as they neared the small cabin tucked between two hills. A cracked window shutter hung loosely on one hinge, and smoke barely whispered from the crooked chimney. Mrs. Hargrove was waiting by the door when they arrived, wrapped in a patched woolen coat. Her hair was white and pulled back tight, and her eyes didn't follow their movements. I heard wagon wheels. That you, Quillen? She called. Yes, ma'am, he said, stepping down. Brought someone with me, Gwendolen Tate. I don't care what her name is. If she can thread a needle, she's welcome. Gwendolen gave a quiet smile and followed the old woman inside. The cabin was warm but cluttered, with drying herbs hanging from the rafters and a worn Bible open on the table. Quillen busied himself chopping kindling while the women sat near the hearth. "She's got good hands," Eliza said later, as Gwendolen hemmed a torn sleeve in her lap. "Doesn't fuss, doesn't chatter, just works." Gwendolen looked up. "My mother said hands should speak before mouths do." The older woman turned her face toward her. "Your mother was right." They stayed until the light faded. On the ride home, Gwendolen's hands rested in her lap, her pulse still calm from the rhythm of the work, the steady quiet of the day. "She's strong," she said at last. "Hard to be that alone for that long," Quillen said, "but she's proud. Doesn't want pity. She loves her home." He glanced at her, the reins loose in his fingers. "Do you?" She didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "Yes." That night after supper, she stepped out onto the porch. The stars had come out sharp above the trees, and the air was cold enough to sting her nose. He joined her without a word, arms folded over his chest. "I had a younger sister," she said after a while. "Her name was Clara." He didn't move, didn't speak. "She used to braid my hair at night. Said it would keep away bad dreams." A pause, then quieter. "It didn't." Quillen's voice came low. "You carry her with you," she nodded. "Every morning." They stood like that for a long time, then she turned to him. "I'd like to stay." He looked at her, the porch light casting his face in soft shadow. "You already do." "No," she said. "Not just for a season, not just because I had nowhere else." His breath came slow. "What are you asking, Gwendolen?" She met his eyes. "If there's space beside you. Not just in this cabin, in your days, in your years." He reached out then, not sudden, just steady. His fingers brushed hers, then held on. "There's been space since the moment you sat by my fire." She pressed her cheek to his chest without another word. The dog padded out behind them, curled at their feet. The frost clung to the porch rail, and the stars above seemed to hum with quiet promise. The first snow came in the night, soft as sifted flour and quiet enough that neither of them heard it until morning. When Quillen opened the cabin door, the world beyond it had turned white. The fence posts wore caps of snow, and the pasture stretched blank and undisturbed, save for the fox tracks that looped near the woodpile. Gwendolen stood behind him, her shawl drawn snug, watching the sky with a stillness that felt reverent. "Won't be riding into town for a while," he said, pulling his coat from the peg. "Best get the barn doors braced before the wind picks up." "I'll bring the feed from the loft," she said, already turning for her boots. He hesitated. "It's heavy work." "I know." She didn't wait for his approval. By the time he stepped into the barn, she was already climbing to the loft, skirts gathered in one hand, her breath turning to mist. They worked without speaking, passing feed sacks from hand to hand, hammering the latch bar across the doors. When they finished, the sun was a pale coin behind thick clouds, and the wind had begun tugging at the eaves. Back inside, Quillen nudged the fire higher while Gwendolen laid out a small tin of dried apples on the table. Her hands moved with quiet certainty, slicing and soaking them in warm water for baking. "That bread you made last week," he said, settling onto the bench, "smelled like something I can't rightly name. Not home exactly, but something close." She didn't look up. "My father used to say cinnamon was the scent God gave to comfort the dying." Quillen leaned back, watching her. "You talk more when your hands are busy." "I think better that way." He nodded once, then let the silence stretch, not out of awkwardness, but because it fit. Later, as dusk pressed close and the cabin filled with the scent of baking, he brought in a small bundle wrapped in oilskin and laid it on the table. She paused, dusting flour from her fingers. "I found this at the Miller place," he said. "Owner left a whole trunk of books behind when he died. Most are sermons, but this one seemed different." She unwrapped it slowly. The leather was worn, the spine cracked, but the gold lettering still caught the firelight. Poems by Emily Dickinson. "I thought maybe," he added quietly, "you might want something for yourself. Something to read when the dark comes early." She opened the book, ran her fingers along the inside cover. "There are words in here I've never said out loud," she murmured. "Then let them live here," he said, tapping the space between them. "If they want to." She looked at him then, fully. "You don't ask for anything." "I've asked for peace," he said softly, "and you brought it." That night, as the wind howled through the trees, they sat close by the hearth, the dog dozing near their feet. She read aloud, voice low, the vowels shaped carefully like she was relearning them. "Hope is the thing with feathers," she read, "that perches in the soul." Quillen listened without speaking, eyes closed, one hand resting near hers on the blanket they shared. When she paused, he opened his eyes. "Do you believe that? That hope comes on wings?" She turned a page with care. "I think it comes quietly and stays if you let it." He reached for her hand, slow and sure. "I want you to stay. I already have." "No," he said, voice roughened by more than cold. "Not just in my home." She folded the book closed. "Then say it plain." He leaned in, his forehead brushing hers. "Be my wife." The fire cracked behind them. She didn't answer right away. Her breath was steady, her fingers warm against his. "I would have said yes the day I followed you here," she whispered. "But I needed the silence to understand why." His lips found hers with the same quiet strength he'd shown since that first day at the depot, steady, without demand. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside, they moved closer, the cabin holding steady against the wind. And between them, peace, not the absence of noise, but the presence of something whole. The wind had settled by morning, leaving behind a world muffled in stillness. A few birds stirred in the cottonwoods beyond the pasture, but even their calls were hushed, like voices in a chapel. Quillen stood beside the stove, steaming water rising from the basin where he rinsed his hands. Gwendolen crouched near the hearth, coaxing flame from ash with practiced patience. "I'll ride into the Miller place tomorrow," he said, drying his hands on a linen cloth. "They'll need help moving the herd downhill before the road freezes over." "They still have that lame heifer?" she asked, not looking up. "They do. Been favoring the front leg since autumn." "I might bring her back here a while, see if she does better on soft pasture." She added a twist of dried spruce needles to the fire, then stood slowly. "I can tend her. I've poulticed worse." He studied her as she moved to the table, tying her apron with a single knot. "You ever work stock before you came west?" "My uncle raised goats back in Missouri. He'd send me out mornings to check their hooves and scrape out troughs." She began cutting strips of cloth from a worn cotton chemise. "Said girls didn't need to be strong, just useful." Quillen leaned his hip against the counter. "He wrong about that." She gave a soft hum, neither agreement nor denial. He was wrong about a lot of things. The day passed slow and steady. She boiled a pot of beans with leftover salt pork, then shelled dried peas near the window where the light was best. Quillen mended a broken latch on the barn gate, then spent an hour re-oiling the leather on her boots without being asked. That night, when the fire had burned low and the dog was curled beneath the rocker, she turned to him with a look he hadn't seen before. Not guarded, not searching, just open. "I want to marry you in the church." He blinked, setting aside the pipe he hadn't lit. "You sure?" "Yes." He shifted forward, elbows on his knees. "We can ask Reverend Greeley to come out here. I want to stand with you in town, in front of whoever's watching." She folded her hands in her lap, fingers laced tight. "I want to be seen." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll ride in come Sunday." She looked toward the window where frost traced the glass. "I'll need a dress. There's a seamstress in Red Lodge, Mora Finch. She'll have something. I'd like to sew it myself." He didn't argue. Just said, "Then I'll take you to Mora's for fabric." They rode into town 2 days later, the wagon wheels creaking in the cold. Gwendolen wore her best shawl, hair braided down her back, and a steady calm in her eyes that hadn't been there before. When they reached Mora Finch's shop, a squat building with curtains drawn tight against the wind, Quillen helped her down, then waited outside while she sorted through bolts of muslin and calico. She emerged with a parcel tucked beneath her arm and a faint flush on her cheeks. "Found what you needed?" he asked. "Yes, and she gave me a patterned piece from her own wedding gown." Quillen touched the brim of his hat. "Kind of her. She said I looked like someone who'd wear dignity better than lace." He chuckled, then grew quiet, watching her face. "You nervous?" "I'm not used to things going right." "We'll take it slow." She nodded, then reached for his hand. "No, we'll take it steady." They married on a clear morning with hard frost on the grass and white breath rising from every mouth in the church. Gwendolen wore a plain blue dress with a hand-stitched hem and a ribbon at her collar. Quillen wore his cleanest shirt and a new wool vest she'd surprised him with 2 nights before. The pews held a few neighbors. Mrs. Hargrove sat near the front, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. Mora Finch dabbed at her eyes beside the widow from the next homestead over. Reverend Greeley spoke soft and sure, and when he asked if she would take Quillen Boyd as her husband, Gwendolen said yes without hesitation. Afterward, they shared coffee and winterberry pie in the church hall. Gwendolen listened as Quillen spoke with the Millers, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. When the sun began to set and the guests drifted off, she stepped out onto the steps of the chapel and looked over the quiet road that led back to the hills. Quillen joined her, pulling his coat tighter. "You warm enough?" he asked. She leaned into him. "Yes." He looked out at the trees, bare and reaching. "Still feel like you belong here?" She turned to him, her voice firm. "I don't feel it anymore." "I know it." They rode home in silence, the wagon slow over the frozen trail. When they reached the cabin, she climbed down first and opened the door. Light spilled out onto the snow, soft and golden. She looked at him over her shoulder. "Come in, husband." And he did, with the sure knowledge he would never leave again. By the time late winter settled in earnest, the rhythm of their days had turned into something quietly sacred. The cabin, once a place of separate corners and careful silences, now pulsed with a steady warmth that came not just from the hearth, but from the way they moved around each other without pause, without question. The heifer Quillen had brought from the Miller place had healed well, her limp nearly gone. Gwendolen tended her before dawn, a wool scarf wrapped tight around her ears, and often returned with a dusting of snow on her shoulders. She spoke more now, but always with purpose, her words measured and anchored to thought. Quillen never filled the spaces between them with anything but presence. He had learned her silences were never empty. One morning, after the snow had crusted hard enough to walk without sinking, Gwendolen left early with a basket and returned with her cheeks flushed, and her arms full of willow branches and pine cones. She set them on the table without explanation and set to weaving. "You making something?" Quillen asked, watching from the doorway as he brushed sawdust off his vest. "An arch," she said, not glancing up. "For the garden." He stepped closer. "You thinking of spring already? I'm not waiting for it." "I'm planning for it." He crossed the room and reached for a branch. "What are you planting?" "Beans, carrots, onions. Maybe lavender along the edges. I want color between the rows." He twisted a pine cone between his fingers. "You ever kept a garden?" "Not one that was mine." After supper, the table cleared and the dog asleep near the stove, she brought out a bundle wrapped in muslin and untied it on his lap. It held a quilt half finished, edges pinned but not yet bound. The pieces were uneven, stitched from remnants of flannel and old aprons. I started it years ago, carried it with me from place to place. I didn't know what I was sewing it for until now." He ran his hand over the fabric, the seams tight but humble. "You want help finishing it?" She shook her head. "I want you to sleep under it." He didn't speak, just looked at her, eyes full and quiet. She reached out and touched his cheekbone, her thumb brushing the faint line of a scar he'd never spoken of. "Tell me something you haven't told anyone," she said. He leaned close, forehead resting against hers. "When I lost her, my first wife, I stopped praying. Not out of anger, just didn't see the use. But the morning I saw you on that bench in Billings, I thought maybe she'd sent you." Her breath caught, but she didn't cry. Instead, she kissed him with the kind of stillness that carried weight. The next day, he hitched the wagon and took her into town without explaining why. She didn't ask. They drove past the mercantile, past the smithy, and stopped behind the schoolhouse, where a small plot of land sloped gently toward a frozen creek. "I bought this last year," he said, helping her down. "Didn't know what for. Just felt right." She stepped onto the snow-packed earth, her boots crunching softly. "It gets good light," he nodded. "I thought we could build a second cabin here, a bit more space. Keep the old one for guests or hands come spring." She turned to him. "You want to stay here that long? I want to raise something that grows." He took her hand, pressing her fingers between his. "Not just cattle, something that needs tending." She looked around the bare trees, the wind pushing snow in low drifts, and then back at him. "I want that too." They spent the rest of winter planning. He borrowed tools from the Miller ranch, ordered lumber from town, and when the thaw finally came, they built with their own hands. She carried nails in her apron pocket and drove them straight. He sawed and fitted beams with quiet focus. The dog followed them between the old cabin and the new site, always staying close. They planted the garden together in April. Her rows were straight and careful, his uneven but eager. The quilt was finished and laid across their new bed, a patchwork of memory and progress. When the first green shoots broke through the soil, Gwendolen stood barefoot in the dirt, her hem lifted, and laughed not loud but deep from the chest. Quillen came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and kissed the curve of her neck. "Still planning?" he asked. "Always." That summer they hosted Mrs. Hargrove for supper, carried wildflowers to the graves of neighbors, and read Dickinson by lantern light. Gwendolen began writing her own verses in the margins of the book, tucked between printed lines. She never showed them to anyone, but Quillen found the book open on the table sometimes. A page folded just so. By fall, the garden had fed them well, and the second cabin stood strong near the creek. She hung dried beans along the rafters and pressed lavender into linen sachets for the drawers. He built shelves for her books and carved her name into the lintel above the door. Years passed. In time, they added a cradle beside the bed. A boy, born on a spring morning while the lilacs bloomed along the fence. He had her eyes and Quillen's quiet way. They named him Elias after no one in particular, just a name that felt like a beginning. They grew older, hands roughened by work, backs bent by seasons, but their days never lost gentleness. They taught Elias to read by the fire, to ride with care, to listen before speaking. He learned to plant, to mend, to show kindness in action. In the evenings, after the chores and supper, Gwendolen still sat by the hearth, her needle moving in steady rhythm. Quillen sat beside her, carving small animals for their son, or running his thumb down the worn spine of that old book of poems. And every night, before they closed their eyes, he reached for her hand beneath the quilt she'd sewn, fingers twined with hers like roots beneath the soil. They never left Red Lodge. They never needed to. Because in a world that had once given them loss, it had also given them each other, and in the quiet, steady days that followed, they built a life that held. A life that endured. A life that bloomed,